You think you can manipulate water access for your precious lakeside empire? Think again? I'm positioned beside an antique control system that regulates the entire watershed feeding Cedar Lake Resort. The very same establishment owned by our tyrannical HOA chairwoman's multi-million-dollar rental operation. 4 hours earlier, they destroyed my grandfather's workshop while I was attending my son's radiation therapy session. They labeled it emergency removal for public welfare. What they failed to realize, my ancestors constructed this water control system in 1923. We maintain the original hydraulic easement rights. And Patricia Blackwood, our despotic community overlord, just committed the gravest error of her immaculately crafted existence. She believes she can intimidate a widowed father, mourning his mother's passing. She's about to discover why you never provoke. Someone with nothing remaining to lose and everything to reclaim. The acrid scent struck me initially. Motor oil and wood shavings mingled with something that shattered my spirit. I returned to my driveway with Jake slumped against the passenger seat. Drained from his chemotherapy session, witnessed a massive orange bulldozer positioned where my grandfather's workshop once stood. Simply stationed there like some metallic predator, surrounded by debris of century-old lumber that had endured every tempest since. 1923. The vision pierced through my chest like a tangible strike. My legs trembled, and momentarily I couldn't draw breath. That workshop wasn't merely timber and hardware. It represented the final physical link to my mother, who'd passed in that identical medical facility 8 months prior. Every summer throughout my youth, we'd invested hours in that workshop, Mom teaching me to operate her equipment, sharing tales about Grandfather Henry and the historical era when neighbors assisted neighbors in constructing things that endured. Papa, where's Great-Grandpa's workshop? Jake's voice barely registered as a murmur, yet it sliced through me like a razor. I'd promised him we'd renovate that workshop together once his health improved. We discussed it during every medical appointment, how we'd refinish the aged wood, perhaps install some wind turbines, transform it into his music studio. Now, it existed only as fragments and memories scattered across the yard like shattered commitments. I could still perceive my mother's voice, resonating in my mind from our final conversation before the disease claimed her. That workshop contains our family's heritage, son. Promise me you'll preserve it. I disappointed her. I disappointed our entire family legacy within the duration of one afternoon. A stocky individual in protective headgear approached, paperwork in hand, appearing as though he'd prefer being elsewhere. You Michael Thompson? Apologies about the circumstances, friend. Here's your documentation. He thrust a brown envelope into my grasp and retreated as if I might detonate. Intelligent fellow. I was fairly close to it. The envelope felt substantial, authoritative, the type of weight that transforms everything. I tore it apart right there in the driveway, Jake observing with those large eyes that had witnessed too. Much for an 11-year-old, he wasn't merely exhausted from chemo. Something else existed in his expression, terror. He comprehended this exceeded just a demolished structure. At 11, cancer patients learn to interpret adult expressions, like survival manuals. Emergency removal notice. The header shouted at me in bold crimson letters. Issued by the Cedar Lake Homeowners Association, effective immediately due to structural safety concerns and community flood risk. The timestamp displayed 3:15 p.m. I verified my phone. We'd been at the medical center from 12:30 to 5 o'clock. Possessed the parking validation stub in my wallet. This notice claimed they'd made numerous, unsuccessful attempts to contact the property owner via registered mail and personal visits before proceeding with emergency removal. That constituted the initial falsehood. I'd been present every day this week except today. They'd waited. They'd specifically waited until they knew I'd be at Jake's treatment, unable to prevent them. Papa, did they photograph it first? Inquired quietly, and I realized my son was thinking like an investigator. He'd retrieved his phone and was already recording the scene, capturing images of the removal notice, the scattered timber, the bulldozer's registration plate. Always collect evidence first. That's what they do on television. Even weakened from chemo, Jake possessed more intelligence than most adults. He understood we were under assault, and he was already retaliating in his manner. Michael. It Sweetheart, I'm deeply sorry. Dorothy Martinez came hurrying across the street, her gray hair flowing behind her like she was 20 years younger. Dorothy had resided here longer than anyone, knew every family history, every boundary line, every secret this community had ever harbored. She was breathing heavily, clutching her smartphone like it contained the mysteries of existence. I captured. Photographs, dear. I observed that surveyor here last week with Patricia and some expensive consultant. They were measuring everything, discussing maximizing lakefront access for premium clients. I knew something was developing. Behind Dorothy, I could observe other neighbors assembling on their porches. Watching the drama unfold, Mrs. Williams looked appalled. Mr. Chen was shaking his head in disgust. But I noticed the Robinsons just stared and returned inside. The community was already selecting sides. She scrolled through her phone, displaying photographs of Patricia Blackwood, our HOA president and local authority fanatic, standing on my property with two men in costly suits. One held a tablet, the other possessed a measuring device. They were indicating the workshop, then toward the lake, then back to the workshop. The photos were time-stamped from last Wednesday. Patricia had been planning this demolition for it. At least 10 days, possibly longer. The emergency was as fabricated as her compassion. Dorothy, can you send me these images? I requested, my voice steadier than I felt. And do you recall exactly what they mentioned about lakefront access? I walked to the debris pile, Jake trailing behind me like a spirit. The bulldozer operator had been careful, or perhaps just fortunate because some of the larger beams remained intact. I knelt and ran my hands over a piece of hand-hewn timber, feeling the tool marks my grandfather had left behind. There, carved into the wood with the careful precision of someone who built things to last forever, were the initials H.T. 1923, Henry Thompson. The man who'd constructed this workshop with his own hands during the Jazz Age. I closed my eyes and could almost see him, sleeves rolled up, working in the summer. Heat because he believed in building something that would serve his family for generations. Papa, why would they do this? Jake leaned against me, his hairless, head warm against my shoulder. The chemo had taken his beautiful blonde hair, but it couldn't touch his spirit. He was stronger than me most days, which made this entire situation even more infuriating. Patricia Blackwood had just torn down a piece of history while my son was fighting for his life. The woman had no conscience. Jake picked up a piece of the carved wood, tracing the initials with his finger. Great-great-grandpa would be angry, wouldn't he? His voice was small but determined. He built this for us and they just discarded it. I don't know yet, buddy, but I'm going to find out. I stood up, brushing sawdust off my jeans, and felt something shift inside me. The grief I'd been carrying since Mom died 8 months ago was still there, but now it had company. Now it had purpose. Patricia wanted to fight. She'd picked the wrong Thompson. We'd been protecting this land for 4 generations, and I wasn't about to let some power-hungry HOA president destroy what my family had built. I pulled out my phone and started taking my own photos of the demolished workshop, the emergency notice, and the bulldozer still sitting on my property like a conquering army. If Patricia wanted to play games with paperwork and legal notices, she was about to discover that 2 could play that game. Carlos Rodriguez emerged from his house 4 doors down, his weathered face grim. He was an Army veteran who'd served 2 tours before coming home to work construction, and he had that steady way of moving that made you feel safer just having him around. Brother, I saw what happened. This is some serious business, he said, surveying the wreckage with a professional eye. That was quality timber, old growth. Someone paid significant money to have this torn down. You don't use equipment like that for emergency demo. You use it when you want to send a message. Carlos knelt and examined some of the scattered beams. Look at this. They didn't just knock it down. They pulverized it, made sure you couldn't rebuild with the original materials. This was personal. Dorothy squeezed my arm. There's something else, Michael. I heard Patricia on the phone with someone yesterday. She was saying something about Phase 2 expansion and needing to acquire the Thompson property within 60 days. Before the summer season, she didn't see me watering my flowers, but I heard every word. Phase 2 expansion. That explained everything. Patricia didn't just want my workshop gone. She wanted my entire property. The workshop was just the opening move. I looked around at my neighbors. Some supportive, some curious, some already disappearing back into their houses to avoid getting involved. This wasn't just about property lines or HOA regulations. This was about whether our community would stand up to bullies or let them destroy everything decent people had built. Jake tugged on my shirt. "Papa, what's that?" He was pointing to something half buried in the rubble. I moved some broken boards and found a metal lockbox, dented but intact. It had been hidden in the workshop's old tool cabinet and somehow survived. The demolition. The lock was broken, and inside were yellowed photographs and documents that made my hands shake. Pictures of my grandfather standing beside the workshop when it was newly built, shaking hands with men in suits. Construction photos of some kind of water system, and at the bottom, a folded paper that looked official with county seals and formal signatures. I examined the demolition notice again, reading the fine print. Immediate compliance with mandatory safety upgrades required. Estimated cost, $85,000. Failure to comply within 30 days will result in additional enforcement actions. $85,000. That was more than I'd made in the last 8 months. Between caring for Jake and the medical bills, Patricia knew exactly what she was doing. She was trying to force me out through financial pressure. But as I held those old documents from the lockbox, I realized she might have made a mistake. She'd been so focused on destroying the workshop that she'd missed what was hidden inside it. "Come on, Jake, let's go inside." Help Jake up the front steps, his small hand cold in mine. He was getting weaker, and Dr. Rodriguez had warned us that the next few months would be crucial. The last thing I needed was a war with the HOA, but apparently, that's what I was getting. I settled Jake on the couch with his tablet and a blanket, then stood at the window, staring at the ruins of my grandfather's workshop. The demolition crew was packing up their equipment, job done, probably eager to get home to their families. The bulldozer operator looked back at me once, and I saw something like regret in his face. He was just doing his job, following orders. But he had destroyed something that could never be replaced. That workshop had weathered the Great Depression, World War II, the space race, September 11th, and everything in between. It had survived everything except Patricia Blackwood's ambition. But as I spread those mysterious documents on my kitchen table, I began to suspect that my grandfather had been smarter than Patricia gave him credit for. Henry Thompson had built things to last, and maybe, just maybe, he'd built in some protections that a power-hungry HOA president hadn't counted on. The basement smelled like Mom's lavender sachets and old secrets. I'd been avoiding it since the funeral, but Dorothy's words about old-timers being smart kept echoing in my mind. Mom had been a methodical woman, a keeper of records and family history. If there was something Patricia didn't know about our property, it would be down here among the boxes and filing cabinets that held for generations of Thompson history. I started with the obvious stuff: property deeds, tax records, insurance policies, standard homeowner documentation that told the story of steady, responsible ownership. But then I found something interesting. A heavy metal box tucked behind a stack of my old textbooks. The lock was rusty, but still functional. I remembered Mom showing me this box once when I was about Jake's age, saying it contained important family documents, and that someday I'd need to know what was in it. The key was exactly where Mom said. It would be taped to the underside of her workbench. Inside the box, wrapped in oiled cloth like some pirate treasure, were documents that made my hands shake. A hand-drawn map of the entire water system, dated 1923, showing every pipe, every valve, every connection between the lake and the surrounding properties. At the bottom, in my grandfather's careful handwriting, H. Thompson, Chief Water Engineer, Cedar Lake County Water Authority. The second document was even better, a contract between Henry Thompson and the county, granting the Thompson family perpetual water easement and emergency management authority over the entire lake system. It was signed by the county commissioner, the State Water Authority, and witnessed by 3 prominent local businessmen. The language was formal, old-fashioned, but the meaning was crystal clear. My family had legal authority over the water rights that fed Patricia's precious resort. Holy crap, I whispered, then immediately felt guilty for swearing in Mom's sacred space. But this was huge. This changed everything. Patricia thought she held all the cards because she controlled the HOA. But she'd been playing with an incomplete deck. My grandfather had been the guy who designed and built the system that created the lake in the first place. It wasn't just some farmer who happened to own land. He was the chief engineer who'd made Patricia's resort possible. I found a third document that made me smile for the first time in days, a letter from the county commissioner dated 1924, thanking Henry Thompson for his continued service to the community and confirming that water management, responsibilities, and authorities shall pass to his heirs in perpetuity. The letter specifically mentioned the emergency water control valve located on the Thompson property, noting that it was essential for flood control and community safety. Jake appeared at the top of the basement stairs, rubbing his eyes. "Papa, what are you doing down there?" He looked pale but alert, his chemo medication making his sleep schedule unpredictable. I climbed the stairs and showed him the documents, explaining what they meant in terms he could understand. His eyes got wide when he realized what we'd found. "So, great-great-grandpa was like the boss of the whole lake?" Jake's voice was stronger than it had been in weeks. "That's so cool. Does that mean we can tell Patricia she can't have our land?" Out of the mouths of babes, Jake had cut right to the heart of the matter. "It means we have options, buddy. But first, I need to have a conversation with our dear HOA president." I helped Jake back to bed, then sat at my kitchen table with the documents spread out like battle plans. Patricia had called an emergency HOA meeting for tomorrow night, probably to discuss ongoing community safety concerns and my failure to comply with mandatory safety upgrades. She was expecting me to show up defeated, maybe even ready to sell. The next evening, I walked into the community center with a manila folder under my arm and Jake beside me. I'd asked Carlos to stay with Jake during the meeting, but he'd insisted on coming. "I want to see you tell Patricia about great-grandpa," he'd said. How could I argue with that? Jake had been through hell with his treatment, and if watching his dad stand up to a bully gave him strength, then he was welcome to front row seats. Patricia sat at the front of the room like some corporate queen, flanked by two other board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. About 40 neighbors filled the folding chairs, most of them looking uncomfortable. Patricia had called this meeting, but I could tell from the faces around me that not everyone was buying her story about community safety. I stood up, Jake's hand squeezing mine for luck. "Thank you for that creative presentation, Patricia. Especially enjoyed the part where you called my grandfather's workshop an unauthorized structure." That's interesting, because according to the documents I found, Henry Thompson built that workshop in 1923 as part of his responsibilities as chief water engineer for the Cedar Lake County Water Authority. The room got quiet. Patricia's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Would you like to explain to everyone here why you demolished a structure that was not only legally built, but was part of the original water management system that created the lake your resort depends on?" I opened my folder and pulled out photocopies of the documents. Patricia's face went red. "Those documents are probably fake. Old papers can be easily forged. Dorothy, would you mind?" Dorothy Chen stood up, her phone in hand. "I have photographs of Patricia meeting with surveyors and architects on Michael's property last week before any emergency demolition was necessary." I spent the next morning learning everything I could about Facebook Live. Jake helped me set up the camera angle, making sure the pile of workshop rubble was visible in the background. He'd insisted on doing his makeup to cover the pallor from chemo, determined to look strong for what he called Papa's movie. God, I loved that kid. "Okay, people, let's talk about water rights and what happens when HOA presidents think they're above the law." I held up the original 1923 documents, making sure they were visible on camera. "My name is Michael Thompson, and 3 days ago, the Cedar Lake HOA demolished my grandfather's workshop while I was at my son's radiation treatment. They called it emergency demolition for community safety." The viewer count was climbing steadily. Carlos had shared the link immediately, followed by Dorothy, Rick, and about 30 other neighbors. The comment section was already filling up with fire emojis and outraged neighbors asking for more details. Social media was a beautiful thing when you had the truth on your side. Here's what they didn't tell you. I walked closer to the camera. The demolished workshop forming a perfect backdrop. Henry Thompson, my grandfather, was the chief engineer who designed and built the entire water system that created this lake. He held perpetual water rights that passed down to his heirs. Me. That's my son Jake, who's sitting right over there looking handsome, despite what chemo's trying to do to him. Jake waved at the camera, his smile bright enough to power the entire neighborhood. The comments exploded with heart emojis and messages of support. People love an underdog story, but they especially love an underdog story with a sick kid and a demolished workshop. Some of you might be wondering why the HOA president would risk legal action to tear down a historic workshop. Well, let me read you something interesting. I pulled out Rick's flash drive and read directly from the printed emails. Patricia Blackwood to Investor Group, Phase 2 expansion requires lakefront access. Thompson property is the key. Workshop demolition is scheduled for Thursday during his son's treatment. Emergency clause gives us legal cover. Viewer count hit 15,000. The comments were coming so fast I couldn't read them all. But the general sentiment was clear. People were furious. Patricia had made a crucial mistake she'd messed with. A single dad and his sick son. In the court of public opinion, that was unforgivable. So here's what I'm going to do, I said, walking toward the lake. Those water rights my grandfather secured, they include emergency management authority over the entire lake system, including the water flow to Cedar Lake Resort. I stopped at the fence line where Patricia's property began. You can see the resort over there, all those expensive boats. And lakefront cabins? Beautiful place. Runs entirely on the water system my grandfather built. I turned back to the camera. I'm not going to do anything illegal, not going to do anything destructive. But I am going to exercise my legal rights. As water trustee, and Patricia Blackwood is going to learn that actions have consequences. The video ended with me walking back toward the camera, Jake joining me, both of us standing in front of the demolished workshop. The metaphor was perfect, destruction behind. Us determination ahead of us. In 12 hours, the video had 25,000 views and 1,200 shares. The local Facebook groups were on fire with discussions about HOA overreach and water rights. Patricia's response came within 24 hours, a certified letter from Hartwell. Hartwell and Associates threatening me with lawsuits for defamation, privacy violation, and inciting community unrest. The letter demanded that I remove the video and issue a public apology. It also included a formal complaint. She'd filed with the county about unauthorized modification of water infrastructure. Even though I hadn't touched anything yet, that afternoon I decided to test the waters, literally. I walked out to the valve system, Jake beside me with his tablet to document everything. The valve was exactly where the 1923 map said it would be, hidden behind a small maintenance shed that most people probably assumed belonged to the county. The black sedan appeared in front of my house at 5:30 a.m. on a Wednesday, like some ominous harbinger of Patricia's escalating desperation. Professional security, complete with tinted windows, and a guy who looked like he'd bench-pressed motorcycles for fun. By noon, there were cameras mounted on utility poles with clear sightlines to my front door, backyard, and the path to the lake. Jake peered through the living room curtains. "Papa, why is that man just sitting there?" "Patricia thinks she can intimidate us into submission," I explained, trying to keep my voice calm despite the fury building in my chest. "She's about to learn that Thompson men don't intimidate easily." The cameras were just the beginning. By Friday, every neighbor had received a professionally printed pamphlet titled Michael Thompson, a threat assessment. 8 pages of carefully crafted propaganda designed to make me look like a dangerous radical. The cover featured a photo of me from the Facebook Live video, but edited to look sinister. With text overlay reading "Water Terrorist" in bold red letters, Carlos brought me a copy, his face grim. "Brother, this is some next-level psychological warfare. She's got fake testimonials from concerned citizens. Quotes from structural engineers about flood risks. Even a timeline of your escalating anti-community behavior. Professional job. Cost her serious money." The pamphlet was masterfully crafted, lies wrapped in legitimate-sounding concerns. It mentioned Jake's illness. suggesting that my emotional instability due to family stress made me unpredictable and potentially dangerous. It included quotes from neighbors I'd never spoken to, expressing fears about their property values and family safety. Most damning, it featured a section about radicalization through social media that made my Facebook Live videos sound like terrorist recruitment. The social isolation was immediate and brutal. Jake's friend Tyler didn't show up for their weekly gaming session. When Jake called, Tyler's mom answered with a cold, clipped voice, "I'm sorry, Jake, but Tyler can't play anymore. Your father's behavior has become concerning to many families in the neighborhood." Jake hung up and turned to me with tears in his eyes. "Mrs. Anderson said I can't play with Tyler anymore because you're dangerous. Am I not allowed to have friends now?" That was the moment Patricia made her biggest mistake. She'd gone after my son, not his property, not his father's health, but his friendships. His 11-year-old social life during the most difficult period of his young life. I felt something snap inside me, a cold rage that made the valve system seem like a child's toy. "Jake, listen to me," I said, kneeling to his level. "Some people are scared of the truth. They're scared of standing up for what's right. Mrs. Anderson isn't a bad person. She's just scared. But we're not going to let scared people decide what's right and wrong." That afternoon, I discovered Patricia's legal masterpiece, a 52-page petition to the county court requesting eminent domain seizure of my property. The document was a work of art, complete with professional photographs, fabricated engineering reports, and testimonials from concerned citizens about the public safety hazard my property represented. The petition claimed my property was essential for community flood control, infrastructure improvements, and that my refusal to comply with safety regulations threatened the entire neighborhood. It included cost estimates for essential upgrades totaling $2.8 million, funded through emergency community assessments that would mysteriously exempt Patricia's resort properties. But the most insidious part was the medical angle. The petition included a section about ensuring emergency access for vulnerable community members, specifically mentioning families with medical emergencies who require rapid evacuation routes. It was a beautiful manipulation using Jake's cancer treatment as justification for stealing our land. Carlos appeared at my truck window, followed by Dorothy, Rick, and about 15 other neighbors I'd never expected to see together. Carlos spoke for the group. "Michael, we've been talking. This pamphlet thing is bullshit, and we all know it. Patricia's gone too far." Dorothy stepped forward with a folder full of documents. "I've been doing research. Patricia's resort business has been reporting losses for tax purposes, but her social media shows constant bookings and luxury renovations. I think she's committing tax fraud," Rick added. "The hardware store sees everything. Patricia's been buying surveillance equipment, printing supplies, and paying cash for everything. She's also been asking weird questions about water shutoff valves and emergency access codes." The call came at 2:45 a.m., jarring me from the first decent sleep I'd had in weeks. Dr. Rodriguez's voice was professionally calm, but I could hear the underlying urgency. "Michael, you need to bring Jake to the hospital immediately. His blood work from yesterday shows some concerning changes." Jake was already awake, sitting up in bed with that uncanny intuition that sick kids develop. "Is it time, Papa?" he asked simply. And I knew he understood more about his condition than I'd given him credit for. We'd talked about this possibility. The moment when his body would tell us it was time for the bone. Marrow transplant. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of medical terminology and difficult decisions. Jake's white cell count had dropped dangerously low. His body was losing the battle against leukemia, and the transplant could no longer be delayed. "The transplant will cost approximately $650,000, Dr. Rodriguez said quietly. "With your insurance approval, your out-of-pocket should be around $65,000. Without approval, ... She didn't need to finish the sentence. "Without approval, Jake would die, and I would spend the rest of my life in bankruptcy trying to save him." I called the insurance company from Jake's hospital room while he slept. After an hour of transfers and hold music, I reached Susan Walsh, the supervisor handling Jake's case. Her voice was crisp, professional, and unmoved by my son's condition. "Mr. Thompson, Your son's case is under extended review due to questions about your family's financial stability and community support systems. Community references. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Patricia had somehow managed to insert herself into my son's medical care. That afternoon, Patricia appeared at the hospital with flowers and a smile, dressed in her best concerned neighbor outfit. "Michael, I heard about Jake's condition. I'm so sorry. I know we've had our differences, but at times like this, the community comes together." The audacity was breathtaking. "I've spoken with Susan Walsh at Blue Cross. She's a dear friend from college, and she's very concerned about Jake's case. The insurance approval process can be complicated, especially when there are questions about family stability. I have a proposal," Patricia continued, sitting uninvited in the visitor's chair. "I'll personally guarantee Jake gets the best care available. Susan can expedite the approval process, and I'll make sure there are no delays. But we need to resolve our community issues first. $850,000 for your property, fair market value, plus a premium for the inconvenience. The sale would demonstrate community integration and financial stability. Jake's insurance approval would be processed immediately, and all our hostilities would be forgotten." I looked at my son, then back at Patricia. "You're holding my son's medical care hostage to steal my land. I'm offering to solve your financial problems and ensure your son receives life-saving care. The choice is yours, Michael, but the transplant window won't stay open forever." After Patricia left, Jake grabbed my hand. "Papa, she's not helping me, is she?" "No, buddy. Oh, she's using you." I heard her talking to someone on the phone in the hallway. She said something about pressure points. An inevitable conclusion? I think she's trying to hurt us. That evening, Carlos and Jennifer Hayes arrived together. "Michael, we found the connection," Jennifer said, spreading documents across the small hospital table. "Trisha's resort company donated $75,000 to Blue Cross's Community Health Initiative last month. The same week, Jake's insurance claim was flagged for review. The donation was specifically earmarked for supporting deserving families in their coverage area. The evidence was overwhelming. Patricia hadn't just crossed a line, she'd built an entire criminal enterprise around crossing that line. I looked at Jake, who was pretending to sleep, but listening to every word. "Papa," Jake whispered, "what would great-great-grandpa do?" I thought about Henry Thompson, who'd spent his own money to build infrastructure that would benefit generations of neighbors. He'd protect his family first, I said. But he'd also protect the community. He'd make sure that bullies couldn't use their power to hurt people. Jake nodded, then surprised me by reaching for Jennifer's phone. "Can I record a message? I want people to know what Patricia is doing to my family." That night, I couldn't sleep. Jake's words kept echoing in my head. "She's using my sickness to steal our home." Patricia had crossed the final line. She'd turned my son's fight for life into a real estate transaction. I looked at Jake sleeping in his hospital bed, tubes and monitors surrounding him like some high-tech fortress, and felt something cold and final settle in my chest. The time for half measures was over. Patricia wanted to play with water rights. Fine, she was about to learn why you never threaten a Thompson's family. The walk to the valve system felt like a pilgrimage through the darkness. My flashlight cut through the night, illuminating the path my grandfather had walked a century ago. When he'd built this system to serve the community, the valve sat exactly where his hand-drawn map had indicated, hidden behind overgrown bushes that hadn't been trimmed in decades. The century-old mechanism looked like something from an industrial museum, massive iron wheel connected to brass fittings that had turned green with age. This was the heart of the entire lake system, the single point of control that fed water to every property on the shore, including Patricia's precious resort. I ran my hands over the cold metal, feeling the history in every groove and scratch. Henry Thompson had designed this valve to be operated manually, believing that such important decisions should require human hands, human judgment, and human responsibility. The wheel was stiff with rust and corrosion, fighting against my grip. Like it was reluctant to be disturbed after so many years of quiet service, but persistence pays off, and Thompson men know how to be persistent. I threw my full weight behind each turn, feeling decades of accumulated grime crack and give way. The metal groaned in protest, then began to move more freely as muscle memory awakened in the ancient mechanism. This wasn't just about water pressure anymore. This was about sending a message that some things, family, dignity, a child's right to live, are not negotiable. I thought about Jake fighting for his life while Patricia played politics with his medical care. I thought about Henry Thompson, who'd built this system to serve his community, and Patricia Blackwood, who's trying to steal it to serve only herself. Each turn of the wheel felt like justice, like the universe finally balancing scales that had been tilted too long in favor of bullies and corruption. The valve turned completely closed with a final, satisfying click that echoed through the night air like a judge's gavel. The silence that followed was profound. No more water flowing through the ancient pipes. No more feeding the system that sustained Patricia's empire. I stood there in the darkness, breathing hard from the effort, and felt the weight of a century's worth of family responsibility settling on my shoulders. Henry Thompson had built this valve system to protect the community. Tonight, I was using it for the same purpose, to protect my family and send a message that some people's greed had consequences. By morning, Patricia's empire looked like a disaster zone painted in shades of brown and failure. The infinity pool had dropped 6 feet overnight, revealing algae-stained concrete that looked like the bottom of a prehistoric swamp. The meticulously maintained lawns were already browning in the morning sun, its automatic sprinklers clicking uselessly against empty pipes that sounded like mechanical death rattles. The golf course looked like a moonscape water. 2 cracked mud flats where expensive koi fish flopped desperately in puddles that shrank by the hour. Guests were checking out in droves, dragging suitcases across what had been a manicured paradise just 12 hours earlier. Patricia's call came at 5:45 a.m., her voice shrill with panic and rage cutting through the peaceful morning air. A maniac. "You're destroying people's vacations. I'll have you arrested for sabotage." "You tried to destroy my son's life," I replied calmly, watching the sunrise paint the empty lake bed in shades of gold and justice. "Now you know what it feels like when someone controls something you need to survive." The resort that had been her weapon against my family was now a muddy parking lot, exactly as I had promised in that moment of rage weeks ago. "Turn the water back on immediately or you'll what, Patricia? Call your friend Susan at the insurance company. Your reign of terror is over." I hung up and drove back to the hospital, feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just hope that Jake would survive his cancer. Hope that our community could survive people like Patricia Blackwood. Tomorrow would face the county commissioners with everything I had. Patricia had made the mistake of thinking that grief and desperation would make me weak. She was about to learn that sometimes, when you have nothing left to lose, you discover exactly how strong you are. The county commissioner's meeting room was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread through social media about Jake's video message, and the story of an HOA president holding a child's medical care hostage had ignited something primal in the community. Jennifer's live stream had over 12,000 viewers. Before the meeting even started, Jake sat beside me in his wheelchair, wearing his favorite blue shirt and a baseball cap that read Team Thompson, a gift from Carlos's army. Buddies who'd driven for hours to show support, he'd insisted on attending despite his weakness, saying, "Great-great-grandpa would want me to be here." Patricia arrived with an entourage that looked like a corporate board meeting, 3 lawyers, 2 men in expensive suits who were probably investors, and